morning, everyone, and thank you for being here. I'm very happy to see that it's a full room. Before I proceed with the introduction, I would like the editorial director of the Democracy and Culture Foundation and of the Athens Democracy Forum, Conniff, to say a few words and introduce herself. And then we will proceed with this lengthy meeting, which I think is going to be at least controversial. Kim? This is not working.
Okay. As Anthony said, I'm the editorial director of the Democracy and Culture Foundation, Conniff. And I just wanted to say a few words welcoming you. Anthony will go into the proper introduction, but just to give you a little bit of insight about my role in this specific project and on this day. I'm a journalist by training. I've been a journalist all my career. And so I'm involved in all of the foundation's content, especially programming our events like the Athens Democracy Forum, but also in helping conceive the projects. So my role in the foundation's projects has been to ask questions, lots and lots and lots of questions, and to challenge premises, to try to help clarify, and also to express the results. So just my role here today will be first to help present the results, and then to act as a moderator along with Anthony, and to help our speakers, and to hopefully get all of you involved in the discussion as well. So just a few words about my role, but Anthony's going to give the proper introduction to the Building Blocks project.
Okay, thank you. This is supposed to be an introduction, but it's not going to be a formal introduction. It's going to be a story. I don't know how good of a raconteur I am, but in any case, this is the story. The Reimagining the Building Blocks of Democracy project was really conceived at the last day of last year's ADF. On the previous night, it was the last night actually, and on the previous night, I had met Luca, who is sitting over there, and he had commented on the importance of the do part on the strategy of DCF. And the next day I was sitting into the press room and I was thinking, yes, the do part, that is an important thing. And I realized that we had talked about the dangers to democracy, we really talked about it to death. And it was about time that we decided what we could actually do about the dangers. So I was sitting down there with a yellow pad, and I started thinking that we should be talking not about democracy in terms of as a political theory, but we should talk about the functional parts of democracy, the mechanisms of democracy, because if we wanted to change something, this is what we should be looking at. So I started drawing on that yellow pad, and I made blocks, vote, executive power, and all the rest. And then Luca walked in, and he looked at what I was doing. He asked me, and he immediately got onto it. Now, after I had filled it in a little bit, I thought I would need to take it to our president and talk to him. The interesting thing is that as soon as I started talking, I said about 2 phrases, no more than that. And Achilles started where I had left, as if he had written the script of the entire thing. So this was really a question that, a meeting of minds, if you want. I then asked, after we prepared an outline with Achilles, I asked a friend who I value and I respect a lot, George Pagulatos, because I wanted to get his first thoughts about it. We met for lunch. He was skeptical, but his skepticism did not deter me. It was not the kind of skepticism that would deter, it was constructive. So he set a series of questions. I got back to him with the questions, and there he was. He said, it's a good idea, let's get ahead with it. I then asked Yannis Mastrogeorgiou, and he introduced me to Haralambos Tsekiris and Panos Dodonis, who were very enthusiastic about it. And then finally, I asked a good old friend from our times as students in the United States, Nikiforos Diamandouros, to join. Now, these people are today sitting at the so-called reflection group, and at the end, they will present their opinion, the comments, and the criticism about what we have to say today. I must admit that makes me a little bit anxious. Now, eventually came down to 5 building blocks, as we call them. I must say there's no great intellectual reason why it should be 5 and not 6 or 7 or 8. But it was, and I must admit, a question of husbanding resources. And in this, Achilles was very, very careful. He's a dreamer, but also he's a realist. When we approached our curators, we approached them with a project that was fully prepared. The outline, the organizational structure, the budget, the timelines, the expected outcomes. So we were very lucky, I believe, in a sense, because we approached 5 great institutions who are here today, and all 5 accepted. And that was important. The basic way in which this worked was that we had a roundtable of experts, and they discussed in each city across the world one of the building blocks. Now, we had also, of course, the terms of reference prepared. It was not that they were accepted without changes, because obviously each curator, each institution has its own opinion on this. We were flexible, but we insisted on only 2 things. The one was that they had to come up with at least one very specific policy recommendation about what to do, how best to change democratic processes so as to make them more resilient to the dangers of the 21st century. And the second was that we wanted that recommendation to be stress-tested by citizens. You can call them citizen panels, but that's what we really wanted to. We wanted to have the input from the citizens. Just for those of you who have not followed all the details, and I will mention this in chronological order, how they occurred. New Democracy Foundation did the power of the people at, I'm sorry about that, but the power of the people in Sydney. The Taejae Academy, in association with the Ban Ki-moon Foundation in Seoul, did the power of the executive. The Bertelsmann Foundation in Washington for the power of information. The Konrad Adenauer Foundation in Berlin for the power of influence, parties, and money. And IDEA, in association with Championship in Tel Aviv for the power of voting. So you can see this was something that happened across continents, We tried to collect a diversity of opinion, and that was at the same time the difficulty, but also the great benefit that one could get. I should also mention that throughout this process, the Berggruen Institute was there also to help and to stand by us. I would like to conclude this little story by saying that we are not looking at this project in terms of one-off. It is not a one-year project. It is a 3-year project, and I'll come back to this, but our aim is to start the discussion going with some proposals, which you will hear in a little while, starting in a couple of minutes. Some of you may find them conservative, others may find them obvious, others may think that they are too radical, but that's exactly the whole point, that we would like this to be the beginning of a discussion. But discussion is not going to be enough. And our project, as I said, a 3-year project, is to actually reach the stage when we will be able to say, this has been done and it will have to be done. I will stop now this story that I told you, because I felt that you should know how this thing came about. And it's interesting because ADF served as, giving the birth of an idea, and that idea, which literally started with drawing lines on a block, came today to a conclusion with 5 roundtables of experts conducted across the world. I will now call upon our rapporteurs, because in each roundtable there was a rapporteur who had the responsibility to take the notes and to prepare the material for today's session. And I will call them in the order in which, as I said, they occurred. This way we don't have any misunderstandings about who is first and who is last. And what is going to happen now is that each rapporteur will talk for no more than 5 minutes, absolutely 5 minutes, on the specific recommendation that that roundtable came up with, 1 or 2 recommendations, and then Kim and I will present the entire package, which is not going to be exactly the same as what you've heard before. There will be parts that are the same, but you will also see that it's in a different setting, and we've exercised our own judgment according to certain criteria about what to present finally and not to. So, without further ado, can I ask Luca, from where you sit, if you want to, but if you want to come up, no? Fine.
I think we were perhaps asked to speak from our seats, but I was offered to speak up here, so why shouldn't I do that? Actually, I'm covering you, Anthony. Is that okay?
No, that's okay. You go and sit on your seat.
Oh, okay. Well, my name's Luca Belgiano-Nettis. I actually wasn't the rapporteur, I must confess. I actually wasn't there in the meeting in Sydney, but I was involved in the design, and I was involved, I'm intimately involved in the organisation that oversaw the process, the New Democracy Foundation. And I went to London after the groups did their thing in the various cities. I went to London and we had a session in London with the real rapporteur, who is Wendy Hugh. Wendy Hugh has written this report, and I'm not going to do much more than read her words, because I couldn't do anything better than that. So, but I might just introduce this by saying we did, the format that we did in Sydney was to have 40 individuals in the room at the one time. The 40 individuals were broken up into 2 groups, one a so-called expert group of 20 that were people that would have defined as having better than average access to politicians, and the other 20 were a group that were selected by lot from the New York Times Australia subscriber list by democratic lottery. So they were the second group were determined to be the citizens, if you like. So the building block for Sydney was called the power of the people. The question that was put to them was, how can we reconnect people to their parliaments in order to produce more trust in public decisions? The common themes emerged from the discussions. Distrust arises from Parliament not making decisions in the public interest. Instead of putting the desires of their electorates first, participants believed that vested interests, especially of those with money and lobby groups, were being prioritised. Political donations and fundraising were identified as significant impediments to responsiveness of parties to citizens. Trust is further eroded when politicians lie and do not keep campaign promises. The increasing difficulty of discerning what constitutes the truth due to dismantling of the monolithic media is a contributing factor. Inclusivity in decision-making, especially in ensuring the voices of individuals with diverse backgrounds are heard, was also a key consideration. Ultimately, 2 recommendations were put forward by the citizens, and with some nuances which I'll discuss later or present later. So the first recommendation was the use of citizens' assemblies to support parliamentary decision-making processes. The second was that political donations and fundraising reform should consist of limiting contributions only to individuals living in the electorate and introducing a cap to those donations. The event sought to apply deliberative techniques in small discussions and task focus. In the first session, after an introduction by my executive director, Ian Walker of the Democracy Foundation, and a welcome by Damien Cave, who was the bureau chief for the New York Times in Australia, the participants, so all these 40, in Parliament House, because it was hosted in Parliament House in Sydney, in the New South Wales Parliament House, and in fact the specific host was the Speaker of the House, the Honourable Jonathan O'Dea. The participants were in these 2 groups. One group had blue dots on their name tags, they were the experts, and the other group, the citizens, had yellow dots on their name tags. The expert panel started by having 2 academics and 1 ex-premier of a state in Australia, and the ex-premier, I confess, is a conflict of interest, is the chairman of our New Democracy Foundation Research Committee. The expert panel then presented, and then afterwards participants with the same coloured dots, so the experts and the citizens gathered in groups of 5 to brainstorm and then ask 3 questions to the expert speaker panel. It was followed by a provocation by one of the expert speakers who is a politician in the New South Wales Parliament from the centre-right. The second session followed the same structure. The expert panels comprised of a journalist, an activist, a civil society actor, and then there was a provocation actually delivered by the speaker himself, Jonathan O'Dea. Is that? That's your phone here. Oh, my time's up. Okay, that's kind of the format anyway. Thank you.
Now we'd love to hear from Shin. She's a senior research fellow at the Taejae Academy. And if you could stay at your seat, actually, we're told by the tech team that it's better for the flow if you don't mind speaking from your seat.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Hello, everyone. The topic of the Seoul Roundtable was the power of the executive. And our primary concern, our primary challenge was how do we find the right balance in the separation of powers? In particular, how do we stop the executive branch from being overpowered, exercising disproportionate power over the other branches of government. So we had three separate sessions at the round table dedicated to each branch of government. And this particular policy recommendation that I brought here came out of our first session on the legislative branch. So the basic premise we started with is this. With technological advances and the rise of social media, the way we understand, discuss, and participate in politics is changing rapidly. But political parties, especially mainstream political parties, have been unable to keep up with the changing times. And because they fail to meet the needs of the people, the enchanted public, they look to political outsiders and extremist parties for alternatives. And this has allowed ideological polarization and populism to take hold instead. So given this political environment, our roundtable participants agreed that whatever policy recommendation that we come up with, it has to address the following three issues. The first is the democratic deficit, where democratic processes are undermined by incapacitated political parties and authoritarian populists. And the second one is the democratic excess, where the more participatory a democratic system becomes, the more vulnerable it is to changes in public opinion and the pressure of re-election. And the final one is consensus building. It is more and more difficult to build broad consensus because political parties believe that short-term gains precede long-term gains. So the policy recommendation that I brought here is a fourth branch of government. So we establish a fourth branch of government that can increase space for civic engagement and also represent the voices of generations, both human and non-human. This idea is still very raw and inchoate, it still needs a lot of refinement, but we were able to at least discuss some parts of it. The first part is, so what does it look like? What would this fourth branch look like? Our original author of this idea, he might be sitting somewhere in the audience. He proposed that it should be a combination of civic representatives and policy experts. So there will be randomly selected civic representatives who will serve a 2-year term. And there will also be policy experts who will serve 8-year term. And that way we will both have some representation from the civil society and also will be able to perform some deliberative function as well. So how does this fourth branch function? Like, what do they do? They will have the representative and deliberative function. In terms of the representative function, they will be able to identify midterm to long-term issues with serious implications for future generations. As I said, both human and non-human. And on the deliberative side, they will be able to facilitate discussions on issues that are mired in political stalemates or agreements that were made under unhealthy, unscrupulous circumstances with populist intentions. So how does this fourth branch help us address the issues that I have put forth earlier? On the democratic deficit side, we'll have direct representations by ordinary citizens. So the randomly selected citizens will join the fourth branch, and they will be able to participate in the deliberative process. Oh, okay, all right. All right, let me just say two more things and then I'll close. And on the deliberative side, experts will help citizens discuss these issues. And on the final, the building consensus side, the fourth branch will be able to discuss issues that have implications for the future and help bring consensus to the broader discourse in the political arena. Thank you.
And I will call about I will now call upon Tony Silberfeld of the Bertelsmann Foundation.
Thanks very much. Good morning, everyone. In the interest of time, I see it's being strictly enforced, so I'm going to give you the highlights more than anything else. We did the power of information in Washington, and for those of us who've been working in DC for a long time, the issue of the information space has been a constant discussion. It's evolved in some ways over time, and certainly during the Trump administration really became critical to how our democracy works or doesn't work, as the case has now become in many ways. So over the course of the discussions that we have had over the years, we started to see there were certain patterns that were happening again and again, and the discussions became very stale. And so what we said to the group of experts who gathered in DC was, let's not have the same conversation again. The whole purpose of this project is to do something different, to start thinking about our challenges in different ways. And so the way that we got together, as I said to our authors and our speakers, come up with 3 different types of approaches to tackling disinformation, and let's start there. Now, over the course of the project, we've gone through a number of different phases that Anthony described at the top, and so we got used to people telling us that we've got it wrong. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion that we have here about ways that we can refine what we've come up with to see if we can improve on where we are right now. So to begin, I just want to mention a couple of things. The first discussion that we had was about how authoritarian governments are using democratic platforms and whether authoritarians should be permitted to use platforms that they deny their own population. That was one area of discussion that we went down and what to do about it. A second was looking at search engines and creating a healthy information environment. And it was really about how search engines are feeding results. And it got into a very technical conversation about rankings and about the ways the algorithms are working and the ways they should be adjusted to improve on the information environment. The third discussion that we had was looking at legal avenues for tackling disinformation for profit. So the discussion really revolved around equating crime that happens offline and crime that happens online, and seeing if for example, certain things that you can do in the actual environment are totally legal online, where they wouldn't be in the physical space. So we talked about that for some time as well. I tell you that just to give you an overview of the types of threads that we decided to pull on. Where we ended up, maybe surprisingly, maybe not, became a discussion around labeling in the information space. And what we've heard over and over is that there is no uniform process for labeling. Whether you're looking at search engines or you're looking at individual platforms from the different companies, there is no consistency across the board about how pieces of disinformation are labeled, so that as a user, it's very difficult for me to discern these various ways of approaching it. So we thought, if we're going to make some improvement, you could go pie in the sky and say, you know what, let's try to grab the most radical idea imaginable, or what we were tasked to do is find something concrete where we could actually move the needle on something. And so we really narrowed in on the issue of labeling in our work. And so we took that away and said, what is it that we can do about labeling In its simplest form, we say, let's make it consistent across every conceivable platform, right? Not an easy task, as you can imagine, given the number of stakeholders that exist in all these different spaces. That was where our discussion ended. We went into the citizens panel, and we said to the citizens, we're thinking about recommendations revolving around labeling. And they said, well, great for your theoretical discussion, great to have a group of experts around, but let's tell you a couple of stories about how labeling impacts us. And we heard a series of stories about real people and real families who have been torn apart by disinformation. Family members who are lost because they've gone down the conspiracy theory path. These are really the knock-on effects of the theoretical things that we sometimes talk about, and when the group in DC gets in a bubble, we forget that they're real people. And so the first recommendation that we heard in terms of reshaping our recommendations is less focus on the technical, more focus on human and emotions and connections that people have with each other, because that's what this is all about, right? The next thing they told us is focus on where you can actually make an impact, right? That's really the task that we had anyway. And third, which leads us to the next bit, I'm not sure how many minutes I have left. Do I have? Am I over time already? All right. I'll give you the third, and then maybe we can talk about the recommendations.
Exactly.
And then we'll pass into it. Sorry about that, Anthony. The third was the importance of having citizens involved in any process that we design around labeling. That in order for it to have any legitimacy or credibility, it's going to require citizens to engage. Not just as in a rhetorical way or as optics, but in a really meaningful way. So I'll leave it there as a cliffhanger, I suppose, and hopefully we'll get a chance to discuss the recommendations themselves going forward. Thank you all.
Thank you, Tony. And just to reassure you, we will talk more about that because in the final reform package, we do talk about the citizen element involved in the final recommendation. So just a little note, because I know there's a little bit of an echo in the room. We do have some earpieces that you can put on that helps you hear directly into your ear what we're saying. So if you have a little bit of an echo, either you have them at the tables already, I believe, or raise your hand and we'll make sure somebody comes over and gives you one of those to help with the sound issue. So I would like to now introduce Marcel Schepp from the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, who will be presenting his recommendations.
Yeah, very good morning to everybody, and thank you to the Democracy and Culture Foundation for the invitation. I will be presenting the results and the findings of the roundtable on the power of influence, representation, and participation through political parties that took place in Berlin in June 2022. The recommendation that emerged from that roundtable is political parties should be more open to establish different types of membership, each with a clear path of personal development within the party. Our premise was that in a liberal democracy, political parties are the main linkage between society and politics, and thus integral to the legitimacy and stability of a democratic political system. However, there's a contradiction between their public perception and systemic significance. Eroding social bases, low voter turnout, and high volatility lead to an erosion of party democracy. The gradual disappearance of political parties from public spaces can be deemed a harbinger of democratic regression. So we asked ourselves, are political parties still living up to their mission? The first challenge here is that there is a lack of approach both by parties and access by the people. Whereas parties are supposed to be many things to many people at the same time, they are oftentimes associated with problems rather than solutions. We can observe that political parties have changed their structure very little over time, talking about the last 40 to 50 years. They tend to undervalue manifestos and members, while they overvalue political communication. Our findings here were that political parties should stabilize politics and negotiate polarization. In short, they should integrate. Hence, they should try to rather project similarity and credibility than public image. For that, however, they need a coherent profile where people, narrative, and means are consistent. Secondly, we asked, are political parties still representative? The challenge here is that certain groups remain fundamentally underrepresented at all political levels. Whereas political parties should be accessible to all underrepresented groups, they also need to represent interests of all relevant social groups to be relevant in the first place. More than any other system, politics is characterized by low social permeability and high determinism. Representing similar interests oftentimes follows similar representation. There are two findings here as well. More descriptive representation leads to more substantial representation. However, representation does not mean that the same interests represent the same interests. Rather, political relevance is clearly a, if not the, qualifying criterion for representation. Thirdly and lastly, are political parties sufficiently participatory? Challenge here is that the degree of participation varies by opportunity and willingness alike. Whereas political parties are expected to offer low threshold and self-initiated participation, they are also required to strengthen inter-party democracy as a prerequisite. Representation reveals a deeper problem. No longer reflecting the lifestyles of the groups they underrepresent, parties are no longer the providers for orientation, that is participation. The finding here is that new forms of participation can strengthen the linkage function. However, they also have to be more than that. Participation is not about communication alone. So far for the experts' findings, in order to relate that to the people, we conducted a survey that is a representative random sample of the electorate population of Germany, private households, about 1,000 people in June 2022. We asked what parties should do and what they actually do in the perception of the respondents, that is. Firstly, political parties are fully expected to take more responsibility, to listen more to their voters than their members, and to take more care of people's problems. That is not surprising. Secondly, political parties are mostly expected to make compromises, to represent different interests, to shape policies, and to select personnel adequately, which is hardly surprising too. Thirdly, however, political parties are not expected to explain politics more, to give more responsibility to the so-called common people, and to be more entertaining, which is, given the above, a surprising result indeed. Three additional findings complement this somewhat counterintuitive picture. Whereas under 1/4 of the respondents have seen a representative personally, over 2/3 have never seen or met one. The more fringe the party, the less the chance to have met a representative. The more center the party, people's parties that is, the more balanced their tally is. In conclusion, the expectations towards an increased overall representation and participation through political parties are not matched by an equally high demand for representation and participation on a personal level. In short, people tend to expect from political parties what they are not always willing to pursue. However, to settle on this would be to give up on the democratic premise and promise of political parties. Thus, we concluded that political parties need to offer more and different forms of membership, modes of participation, if you will, to more and different target groups while catering to their individual needs and abilities better, to ensure more representation of different societal interests. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marcel, and I will now call upon our last speaker for this session, for this part, Amir Kochavi from Editorial, who is also the Hod Hasharon mayor in Israel. Amir.
Thanks. Thank you very much. As you said, my name is Amir Kochavi. I'm 42 years old. I'm the mayor of Hod Hasharon, a city of 65,000 people in the center of Israel. Also a member of IDEA, which is Israel's leading liberal think tank, which is a part of this attempt to answer the question, what can we do to make democracy more resilient? And to be more specific, our roundtable was discussing the power of voting. As I said, I'm a mayor for the last 4 years. Quite a short time after I was elected, COVID-19 struck. And what we realized pretty soon within the development of COVID-19 in Israel was that the people in the cities, the citizens of Israel, would rather get their information from their mayors. They would rather get their information, they would rather get their orders or ability to understand what is going to happen the day after tomorrow from their mayors. The trust in central government offices was getting lower and lower by the day, and the trust in local authorities was getting stronger and stronger by the day. And when we were discussing the power of voting, we realized that in Israel, while central elections voting percentages are on the fall, voting percentages in local elections are on the rise. So we were discussing the abilities or the potential of raising the voting patterns in Israel or as a whole, and we were discussing mandatory voting, and we were discussing other possibilities on the agenda to make people come out and vote. But then we decided that was not the main issue, because you can have people voting by mandate and they will be voting for anything just to be able to say they voted. We realized that the main issue was the distrust people had with central government and central politics, distrust that caused them to stop voting. They don't believe in this part of the game anymore, and the numbers are getting lower and lower. So one of the ideas that we developed, and I think distrust came up in your agenda and also in Luca's agenda and also in yours. So distrust is the main issue, I think, when we're talking about strengthening democracy, and the way we suggested to rebuild this trust, or the main idea was to rebuild the trust between the citizens and the politicians, and the way we thought about going about it was to strengthen local politics by means of letting the people in the cities, in the rural areas, take charge of their own lives, to build communities, and we have quite a few ideas how to develop this, but the time has run out even before I started speaking, so I think I will leave that for the next round of questions. But the main idea is to rebuild the trust between the people and politics, between people and the politicians, and to be able to bring them in via the things that touch them the most, which is what is happening back home, what is happening where they live, and showing them that when they influence, when they make an influence, and when they take part in rebuilding the community, then they can do that on the central government level as well. So that was it for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Amir. I think that we will now move into the part where Kim and I have brought together and somehow restructured the proposals. And this will give you the opportunity to see the reasoning behind some of them in the way that we've looked, and also to summarize and see them more as a total. So, can we
call up the presentation?
Yeah. Okay. Kim, will you, no, don't. Okay. Kim, will you
So I'll
start?
kick it off. So as you just heard, we had 5 cities, 5 amazing sets of recommendations. But then we had the difficult task of trying to refine them and also narrow them down at the same time, refining and streamlining. So we all came together in London, or at least a representative from each of the curators came together in London. And we had the task of both identifying the underlying unifying axes, if there were any, eliminating possible contradictions, if they existed, and then we also had to do away with what you could call the local element. That is, there were some of the proposals were addressed primarily to the local, very hyper-local audiences or local context, or even a national context, but that wouldn't be able to be exported to other communities. So we were trying to eliminate that as well. So we had to carry out this task without compromising the integrity of the original proposals or altering their intent. So as Anthony mentioned in his introduction, our aim when designing the project was to reach a coherent set of recommendations that would serve as a starting point for a wider debate about how democracy should best evolve. But there was no guarantee that this could happen, that we could achieve this. On the contrary, having 5 different groups of experts and concerned citizens, with each group discussing a different issue at 5 diverse capitals around the world, you'd think it might be more of a recipe for failure than for success.
Okay. Before we go down to the specific proposals, I'd like to clear up some of the definitions the conceptual definitions that we worked with. First of all, what is democracy? We worked on the basis that democracy is the rule of law and the respect for human rights. These are the very basic elements. As a result, we consider that democracy stands at the nexus of culture and identity. And identity is a question of culture and a question of civilization. Now, the third point that we would like to clarify is that democracy is a process, it's not an end product. And as a process, the design and the integrity of the process is critically important. And the fourth point that we would like to make is that democracy has no ethical relativism. In other words, you either have democracy or you do not have it. There's nothing in between. And we are talking about liberal democracy. Now, as I had said, we asked each roundtable to come up with at least one policy recommendation. What we discovered was that eventually we had something like 20. And not all of them were as fruitful. There was one which came up with something like 12 recommendations because they were discussed. Eventually, of course, they reduced them as well. But I'm mentioning this because it goes to show how people were concerned. In other words, the issue of democracy is something that is of concern. Now, it was obvious when the discussion started taking place that the first thing that happened was that they tried to identify the problem and then find a solution. Now, when we looked at it, we saw that the basic problem is the breakdown of trust. This came through in all the discussions. It came through in all the recommendations. The breakdown of trust. And the breakdown of trust was, in all cases, with the government, with the party, with the legislature, and, interestingly enough, with technology. Because people did not trust technology. And they did not trust technology because they didn't know about it. And this leads to an aside that governments who want to support democracy have got to educate the citizens in technology, in the digital revolution. Really, one of the main problems is a sense of alienation and lack of connection with democratic institutions. This is the result, and this comes very clearly through, of a disconnect between ordinary citizens and elected officials, as well as the growing power of global unelected institutions. Citizens feel that their voice and their vote is meaningless, and that they have very little influence themselves on their own daily lives. And they also feel that ballot is an empty ceremony. These were all results that became very, very clear with, if one read the transcripts of the discussions. Now, the next question concerns the reason for the breakdown. We identified in each of the cases the following. Between citizens and government, the feeling was that the government has too much power. Between citizens and the party who identified that the influence of money was too strong. And also that the representation of the parties was too narrow. Between citizens and legislature, that legislators have far too little power. And between citizens and technology, as I said before, that citizens' input is too restricted, and there's a fear of a social and economic divide. And this is extremely important. What is the solution? The solution is citizen engagement. It came through all the recommendations. And it's extremely interesting to see that this, in effect, is a return to the very basis of Athenian democracy, citizen engagement. There was not a single solution that was proposed that did not contain citizen engagement, in effect. Now, citizen engagement was proposed at the local level, it was proposed at the regional level, and it was proposed at the national level as well. So you see that there's a disconnect, or that the citizens feel they need to be involved at every single stage of government. They are not interested in doing one thing only at one level. They want to go everywhere. Now, these proposals were not theoretical. They were very practical. This is what they wanted. They came up with very specific proposals on how they wanted things done. And the next question is, what is the usefulness of the expected results? Now, recommendations were either to be advisory or obligatory, but they should be accountable. The state should be accountable. Accountability is something that is being demanded now. Now, what are we saying? We're saying that the debate that took place in all the roundtables between the need the recommendations of the citizens to be advisory or obligatory did not reach a conclusion, but I would say that the majority wanted this to be obligatory. However, all insisted that the government should be accountable if it did not follow the recommendations. And it wanted to be accountable, at least in one sense, in the sense that the government should explain in public the reasons for which it did not accept the citizens' recommendations. Now, keep this in mind because it is something quite important to come through afterwards. Well, we now have to, having clarified the background and the underlying trends, we now come to the recommendations themselves. I must say that Kim and I, to a certain extent, exercised our democratic prerogative, and we tried to concentrate on those that, as Kim said, were the ones that we thought would be applicable in this case. And just to remind you, the criteria that we used was that we have to have realism in application, in starting the discussion, and in the possibility of universal application. So, having given you now this background, I will ask Kim to start on the specific proposals, and we'll alternate our discussion in this way.
So on to the specific recommendations, which we ended up dividing into three parts. They seem to divide quite cleanly along certain lines. So the first part was recommendations involving direct citizen engagement, both in the legislation and in the balance of power between legislation and the executive. So for that recommendation, which you've heard in some form earlier today, is that parliamentary committees or the equivalent that are convened to discuss and/or amend government-proposed draft laws must call for citizens' assemblies to debate the laws and must take their recommendations into account. So the exact phrasing, as per the rapporteur, was the use of citizens' assemblies to support government decision-making processes. But for the debate on this issue, as Anthony mentioned earlier, it wasn't really settled whether this would be in an advisory capacity. Obviously, the preference for us was definitely and that there would be an obligatory dimension, but we also have to think about what is most realistic in terms of implementation. So at the very least, if the recommendations of citizens are not adopted, then they need to be, it needs to be explained publicly why those recommendations weren't taken into account. So it's true that committees already do use outside advice, but it's been observed that experts' advice, often it's the tendency to use experts only, the same people again and again, and there's no real exchange between the public and the legislators. So the second recommendation aims to reduce the power of the executive. Moving on to that. This recommendation, as you've heard earlier, is to set up a fourth body of legislature composed of ordinary citizens to serve alongside policy experts and deliberate issues locked in political stalemates or requiring additional review. So you had heard a slightly different phrasing earlier. I won't repeat that. But we decide to refine it a bit. And it should be noted that this assembly is to consider issues on which the political parties cannot find common or are having trouble finding common ground. It's presumed that this works against the benefit of society as a whole, and citizens come in as a sort of arbiter. Another recommendation was to strengthen and expand the different forms of local democracy, allowing for more direct and immediate connection between the voters and the public officials. So this was to create empowered hyper-local citizens' assemblies, where a group of citizens selected by lottery debate on important issues and make binding decisions. So this amounts to adding, of course, a local regional component with locally elected public officials obligated to consider the wishes of local citizens in their decisions. So very much in the same way that we talked about the legislatures. And this could be expressed through town halls, citizens' assemblies, digital participation. And again, if the citizens' opinions are not adopted, the officials must at least explain why they were not adopted as part of the final decision. So Anthony's going to move on to part 2 of our set of recommendations.
Well, these are the reforms for citizen engagement to deal with the power of influence, money, through party reform. And again, what we have as a recommendation is greater citizen participation. Now look, parties legitimize and delegitimize systems, democracies as well as autocracies. Parties have increasingly distanced themselves from the social basis, are concerned with individualization, and a lot of them have returned to the traditional role of bread and entertainment. Essentially, as one report put it, parties have disappeared from the public sphere. It may be a bit of an extreme position, but it is still something to consider. So, when it comes to party reform, the suggestion that is made is that the parties become more representative, and the proposal, the recommendation is that they should be more flexible in establishing different types of membership: part-time, full-time, supporting, executive, each with a personal path of development within the party. Now, mind you, as you can see here, this is taking really a leaf out of a business structure, where you want the party, the member who comes in, to know where he's going, what the result of his development is going to be. And it's interesting that there is this connection between the public and the private sphere, as you can see it. But the whole idea here is to make the party really to expand its representation, and it is felt that if you offer the prospect of personal development and involvement in this, this will encourage people to participate in parties, which is not the case today. I was talking the other day with some of our friends, and they were lamenting the fact that some of the best people do not want to get involved with the parties. Now, the second recommendation was to reduce the vested interests and influence that these have. And this is where we come back to the issue of political donations, and it is that it should be limited to contributions that come only from individuals living in the electoral region, while simultaneously introducing a cap on each contribution. Now you can understand what this does. It is really a triple proposition if you look at it. It touches at party reform through the lens of money, it indirectly promotes citizen engagement, and it upgrades the local dimension in the political give and take. By reducing the contributions to the local level, it prevents the influence of money from spreading across the national level. You will find all these recommendations perhaps a little bit radical, but as I said, our idea was to come up with things that could start the discussion going and could have a practical application. Now, there's a third part, and I will ask Kim to conclude this part.
So the third part of our recommendation concerns the information ecosystem. And as Tony touched upon in our debate about the information ecosystem, and I was there at the Washington Roundtable, one of the conclusions that emerged was that disinformation often takes hold because people trust information that they found themselves. So this especially came through in the citizens panel, through their own networks. So they see social media as a crucial way to express and buttress their own opinions, and they distrust information that they feel is forced upon them by a self-declared authority or an institutional authority. So in that case, as Tony alluded to earlier, we determined that it was crucial that citizens be part of the process, that they need to feel like their voices are taken into account when designing the policy. So from the get-go, from the conception and design level. And so when it comes to the subject of labeling information, state-sponsored or otherwise, they need to be involved in determining what qualifies and how that relationship's expressed. And that process needs to be transparent. So our recommendation, and that is the only way that the citizens are going to buy into the final policy. So our recommendation is the following, very similar to what Tony presented. Select a citizens' assembly comprised of the public and advised by subject matter experts, and task them with designing a process for defining and labeling disinformation across search engines and social media platforms. So this would be a multi-step process, would begin with at the educational level, educating people about citizens' assembly participation, and then continue through a pilot project to test that model before scaling it up.
Okay, this concludes this part of the presentation. I hope we have given you enough food for thought and criticism. I will now call upon the young people, the students in our audience, to offer the first reaction to the recommendations that we've. Now you will speak from the table.
Yes,
okay.
Please stand up in front of the table. We have a little picture. So we'll hear from Michele Castrazza Azadi, Larissa Mokel, and Elena Vocal from the International Youth Think Tank Fellows, who will challenge everything that we just put in front of you.
We'll try our best. Hi everyone, I'm Michele and I'm part of the International Youth Think Tank. And what we want to do from the kids table here is to challenge a bit some of the proposals in the reform package. And I want to start from saying that we as humans, we really struggle to think outside our box. And you don't wake up one day saying, I want to think outside my box, and you suddenly come up with original ideas. That's not how your brain works. In order to be original, you need to talk to different people. We have done that, and I will soon tell you how. What we are afraid we see here is a lot of speaking in a bubble, in a way that in a lot of the roundtables you have had, I can imagine what sort of people were there. And, in a way, this, as a consequence, renders your proposals very much institution-centered rather than people-centered. We have seen a lot of imposing rather than enabling, a lot of pushing rather than pulling. And in general, this is very top-down. And top-down is always good, of course, but we have talked to the people, and I will soon tell you how, and we have heard different things. So since last year, we have started running open chair democracy talks, which I will now refer to as OCDT. In an OCDT, we go to the street, and we talk to strangers. It's very simple, but I assume that most people here have never done it. And what we hear from the people is very different from what you propose. And the biggest difference is that instead of the people wanting something imposed on them, they want space and time to bring about change in their own terms. So for instance, when you talk about citizens' assemblies, people like that, but they don't want to be given a specific time and location and topic. They want to be given a community room or a digital space to discuss politics whenever they want and to talk about what they want. And in a way, this is a challenge to your proposals because the people want more space rather than things. And they have the energy to bring about change. And I guess I will now leave the floor to my friends here that will tell you a bit more specifically how we plan to give space to the people.
Yes, so what we would suggest for the following years of the Building Block Initiative is the one point of including education as an own building block by itself, because we think it is so crucial for people to feel confident. For example, in the information recommendation you brought up, we think it would be more efficient to target the problem by its roots, because we think just labeling information as disinformation, that's just a symptom. And we think educating the people enabling the people to identify disinformation by themselves is much more efficient. And another point we want to bring up is the institutionalization of the youth. So let me show that in the proposal of the party membership. We think including the youth organizations of the parties more, on the one hand, in the party politics, as well as in the national legislation, would be very efficient, because the young people then would have the feeling to be included, and that might bring them to the point that they feel they can be engaged in party politics more. And I also here want to mention one of our proposals we brought up in our own youth conference 2 years ago. That was a membership for young politicians. So one politician in office can be a mentor for a young person who is at the start of his or her career.
So now on a more general note, We found a general lack of acknowledgement of individual rights and needs regarding gender, race, and age in your proposals, in the building blocks. Acknowledge these rights and the needs will enable the widening of the electorate and a shift from democratic nations to democratic people. This will allow to address issues such as low election turnouts that we recently seen in, for example, Sweden and Italian elections. As you mentioned very many times, as you pointed out, and as we found in our open chair democracy talks, we found that people feel distant, too distant from the political stage. They perceive politics as something that is elitist and very far away from them, creating a breeding ground for populism to grow and become extremely influential. So what would it take to change this? Again, in our open chair democracy talks, we found that people are more easily engaged on a local level. So local democratic participation is more effective. So why not? Let's start from there. Reshaping these recommendations, your recommendations, and adapting them to more local realities. Let's change the scale of democracy. So let's expand from the institutions to the people in the city, in the towns, and in the streets. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those, and I'll be talking to you afterwards to get your notes.
Oh, yes.
We will have some other youth hacks later on today from the Global Liberal Arts Alliance students as well, so be ready to hear those. Now we'll have a short break, about 10 minutes just to stretch your legs, get a quick cup of coffee, and join us here again to hear from the reflection group in 10 minutes.
I would like to point out, before you all go, that the next stage is going to be the sort of critical one. First, we will hear from the people who first helped get this whole thing intellectually off the ground. And then, of course, you'll have something like 3/4 of an hour for an open discussion, perhaps even more. So you'll all be able to vent your criticism and your opinion, and we will be able to answer it, because I think we already have urban sort of things to say to what you're proposing. So enjoy your coffee, and please be sharp about coming back. Thank you.